But since the IPCC reported, I want to point out that a lot of new information is available. And that is important because some of this is suggested to people like myself who have been in the field for 30-odd years that actually we've underestimated this. And I'm not going to go through this slide, it'd take me too long to do that. But just to pick up on one or two of the points. For example, the second last one was a real surprise to me because as a scientist 20-odd years ago when we were studying the global carbon budget, we thought that as we warmed the planet we would actually stabilise the ocean and change the capacity of the ocean to take up carbon. But I hadn't anticipated this one. We've found from satellite observations that the desert areas of the oceans, that is where the biology of the ocean is limited by the lack of upward movement of nutrients from the deep ocean, because the oceans are stable, they're hot at the top and cold underneath, those areas are increasing right at the moment by between 1 and 4% per annum in all of the oceans. And that's because the ocean's becoming more stable and there's less nutrient getting to the surface. So what impact will that have? Certainly have an impact on those ecosystems, but it will also have impacts on fisheries and so on. So there's a whole range of new findings that have come out just recently. This diagram is a picture of obviously the Arctic, and it's running from 1980, and I'll call out the dates roughly. The very wide area is areas where there are 5-year-old ice, and going down to the very light whitish blue areas where it's 1-year-old ice. We're now at 92, 1992, 1995, 1997, 2000, 2003, 2005, 2007. We got a big surprise after the IPCC report last year when the aerial extent of sea ice decreased in 1 year by 20%. That was not projected. But the biggest surprise is that all the 5-year ice and older, all of the old ice, the thick, resilient ice, is gone. This led the Ice and Snow Institute in Boulder, Colorado, to conclude in May there was not a zero probability that we would lose all the ice this year, whereas the IPCC report last year said it would occur most probably in 2050. Now, I'm not trying to scare people. I want you to realise that we don't know everything, and we have to manage the risk that, in fact, these changes could take place much more quickly than we anticipated. A little bit about the extent of warming. These contours on this map of Australia are 3 degrees apart. So this is what happens if we warm the planet by 3 degrees, which at the moment we're looking at doing this century. We shift the climatic zones of Australia by those distances. The little arrows are for different levels of stabilisation of global concentration. These are big changes in terms of the way Australia will look, whether it be from agricultural point of view, natural ecosystem point of view, or whatever. I think what we're talking about tonight, however, is how do we interpret these points from the point of view of the developing world. And Bob has already pointed out most of the information on this slide, but I want to reiterate this because I think he's absolutely right. And the first issue, and you should be clear from the science slides that I've just shown you, that not everywhere on the planet is going to be impacted the same. And in fact, not in every area of the planet are we as certain as we are in other areas of what is going to happen. So it's a very inequitable distribution of likely impacts. As has been pointed out, there are people leaving island nations now, not in 20 or 30 years' time now, because the sea level's already gone up and destroyed their fresh water supply. So exposure to some of these things is now, earlier for some people. It'll be very inequitably shared across the planet. The second thing, as is pointed out, that we all contribute to this very differently. And if you believe some people who are trying to delay action on this, Australia's contribution is insignificant. We actually emit 550 million tonnes of carbon dioxide a year. The UK emit 750, not a lot of difference. Canada 850, France 450. All of these nations actually emit about the same. They can all put up their hand and say we won't do anything until someone else does it. It isn't a sensible way to look at this particular issue. Of course, the US and China are around about 6,000, and what they do is important, although some of you all read recently that some of the states now are taking some very proactive action in the US independent of their federal government. But the third point about this is that some of us are wealthy relative to the rest, and therefore we are going to be able to cope with some of this change better than others. So it is, as was pointed out, this combination of exposure being related to people who actually have very poor capabilities economically to really be able to cope with it. My own view, I think, is that this is going to be the hardest part of climate change to deal with, dealing with these inequities in a world in which so much of our decision-making is really quite selfish. And I think that that's really what this, the next couple of presentations will be about. How do we treat the reality of this science, given its certainties and uncertainties, in the framework of actually supporting the developing world and the movement towards a more equitable world? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Graeme Pearman, for that very sobering account of where the science is up to.